All right, welcome to week 13. This week we are exploring nationalism and national identity. Dukovic and Eastwood began the chapter by discussing the status of the 20th century as witnessing unprecedented outbreaks of genocidal violence. Part of the horror of genocide is mass killing is only part of the problem. Often the actual violence is occasioned by even more death due to exposure, disease, and famine that comes from displacing massive numbers of people. Genocidal mass killings have persisted into the 21st century in South Sudan and Myanmar in particular. And this raises the why question that drives this chapter. Why do some identity groups engage in mass violence against others? Is it related to the question of identity itself? Or is it related to something else like competition for land or scarce resources? Um, there are a lot of esoteric concepts floating around in this chapter, in no small part because questions of nationalism and national identity have kind of a mythical quality to them. The authors explain national identity by comparing it to identity at the individual level, which amounts to, what constitutes your sense of self? How do we explain ourselves to others? How do we make sense of ourselves? In no small part, we rely on those aspects of our identity that we value, along with our imaginative stitching together of aspects of our narrative self that only make sense to us because we make it make sense through acts of will. Some define their sense of self by way of fidelity to some moral tradition or ethnic affiliation, and thus become, Irish Catholic. Um, the authors note that identity at the national level is cultural, historical, and political, and that means that identities are manufactured in a sense. They are expressed symbolically, they evolve and mutate over time, and they influence and are influenced by the distribution of power in society. And that's certainly something we can talk about. The study of nationalism revolves around three basic theories. The idea of primordialism posits that nationalism is an essential feature of human identity, and all societies have some sort of national identity. Perennialists, in contrast, reject that essentialism and argue that not all societies possess a national identity, but that in fact some pre-modern societies clearly did. And so for perennialists, nationalism is not historically bound. Modernists, on the other hand, contend that national identity is in fact a distinctly modern phenomenon. Another important kind of dimension of this argument is the idea uh, about structural versus constructive views of nationalism. Structuralists argue that big, difficult to change parts of society determine national identity, where constructivists contend that nations are symbolic constructs, and they emphasize national identity as a product of creative individuals and groups to define and redefine their identities. When you look at, for example, the United States, the idea of Americans didn't really begin to emerge until well into the 19th century, and it is really a post-Civil War phenomenon. Prior to the Civil War, most people considered themselves to be Virginians or New Yorkers or Georgians. It's only in that aftermath of the Civil War that you begin seeing the beginnings of the national myths. You know, uh, America the Beautiful and all that kind of stuff that begin to really kind of stitch us together a little bit. Our country profile for discussion this week is China, which of course is an enormous nation with a rich history, and which today in three distinctive ways is advancing a much more assertive sense of Chinese nationalism that is disturbing in many ways. They are projecting power into the South China Sea, building man-made islands with a clear intent of controlling shipping lanes in ways that hurt the economic and political interests of neighboring countries like the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. Secondly, they are essentially colonizing Xinjiang province, which is in far northwest China. They've been accused of forcing the ethnic Uyghur population, which are also they're Muslims, into what amount to re-education camps. And third, China appears determined to challenge the autonomous status of Hong Kong. China's communist regime has historically been characterized by pragmatism and risk aversion, a willingness to expand economic rights slowly while retaining a not-so-soft political authoritarianism. Its current president, Xi Jinping, was recently named president for life. What do we think about that? Will these assertions of Chinese nationalism succeed, and will China become, a rival of the United States? I think those are very interesting questions. This week we only have the forum and the quiz, so let's make sure we do good work in the forums and ask good questions and have a good conversation. And let's have a great week.